Hello, everybody, and good morning. As you get settled, we're just going to get started here in just about, or at 9:30. So as everyone's entering the screen this morning, as always, we will be doing all of our questions and answers through the Q&A section. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to just pop your questions in there. We'll have time at the end, or if it's something's very pertinent, we can pop it in the middle. If you have any comments, you can use the chat. And at the very end of our presentation, if time allows, what we'll do is, because we're not usually a huge group, we can allow people to, we'll open it up so that you can speak directly to our presenter with your microphones. To do that, we ask that you use the raise hand button. So just click on that, raise your hand, and we'll open up your microphone in order to ask your questions at the end. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Emily.
Thanks, Amy. Good morning, everybody, and thank you all for joining. I'd like to welcome everyone to week 5 of the 2021 Watershed Wednesdays series. I'm Emily Dekar. I'm the Ag Coordinator for the Upper Susquehanna Coalition. Watershed Wednesdays are hosted by the Upper Susquehanna Coalition and the Otsego County Conservation Association. The weekly sessions are taking place instead of the Upper Susquehanna Watershed Forum for 2021. We'll be holding sessions every Wednesday through October. We started in August and they'll run all the way through October. The full schedule is also posted on our website and our Facebook page. Each session is recorded and will be posted on the USC website for future viewing in case you want to go back and take a look at things. You can also sign up for email announcements on the USC website under the Watershed Wednesdays tab. To get things started, our presenter today is Lamont Garber. Lamont is the Watershed Restoration Coordinator for the Stroud Water Research Center in Avondale, Pennsylvania. He works with landowners, producers, and conservation organizations to advance soil health, stream health, and water quality in Pennsylvania, as well as the wider region. Lamont is going to give an overview of targeting outreach about buffers and other BMPs in smaller agricultural watersheds. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Lamont.
Morning, everyone. As Emily said, I'm Lamont Garber, and I work for the Stroud Water Research Center. And if you're not familiar with Stroud, many of you may be, but Stroud is a bit different from a lot of agencies and organizations you might be familiar with. Stroud is first and foremost a research facility where we try to understand how streams work. Streams and rivers. So we have most of our staff being scientific researchers. I happen to work for our restoration program. So I'm not a scientist. I work with our scientists on a lot of questions around stream function and stream restoration. But I primarily work with landowners who have streams on their property, like many of you probably on this call. And I would say most of those landowners are farmers. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we're going to get into this topic of targeting. So we're talking about targeting resources, financial and technical resources, education, perhaps monitoring in small watersheds. And when we're talking about small watersheds, think about those headwater streams in your areas, those first and second order streams that might actually be so small that you can jump across them, right? The watershed might be 1,000 acres in size or 1,500 acres in size. It might only have a dozen to 2 dozen landowners to work with. So we really are talking about a targeting process that is really dialing in a very small geography that will enable us to work with most landowners, hopefully in that watershed, but also to monitor the impact of the conservation practices that we install in those very small watersheds. So I would like to thank our many partners in this work. Here are just a couple. Here on your right-hand side, Chesapeake Bay Foundation has really helped us in the watershed that I'm going to talk about as a case study. Lancaster Clean Water Partners is leading the effort in targeting streams in Lancaster County, where we're going to be focusing this case study. National Fish and Wildlife Foundation has been a huge supporter of our efforts in this and other small watersheds, but there are many, many others. Conservation District, NRCS, watershed groups, we have a lot of partners in this work. So what do we mean by targeting? So let's look at this maybe from the standpoint of what it would mean not to target. Here is Lancaster County, where I work, and I apologize. I know Lancaster County gets a lot of attention. I'll explain why we're doing so much in Lancaster County, but it also happens to be where I live, so I know the most about this area. If we weren't targeting our efforts, we'd be offering our financial and technical assistance to farmers throughout this entire region. In this county, any farmer that would be within the border of the county, they'd be eligible for our programs. Whereas if we went about this work in a strictly targeted fashion, we'd only be offering our help and our education and our resources in those targeted watersheds. And in this case, Lancaster County is undertaking an effort to target those watersheds here in this map that are in orange or blue, 18 of them. So it could either be a non-targeted effort or a hyper-targeted effort or something in between. And perhaps many of you work in both contexts. I'm going to be talking about macroinvertebrates as part of this process. And why macroinvertebrates? And if you're not familiar with that term, many of you are, we're talking about very small organisms, mostly insects that don't have backbones, hence invertebrates, but they're big enough that we can see them, collect them in a stream, take them back to our lab or your kitchen and identify them. The reason they're so important to our efforts and to this targeting question is that macroinvertebrates, along with other types of monitoring parameters, chemistry, temperature, etc., but these macroinvertebrates really tell us a lot about the health of the stream that we're working in. If we're not finding a good collection of those shredders, collectors, predators, scrapers that you see at the bottom of this slide, it's likely that the rest of this stream system is really not very healthy. And when we have a very poor population of these macroinvertebrates that either we or regulators might be sampling, that tells us that that stream is unhealthy. And in many cases, if it's really unhealthy, it's on our state or your state's impaired waters list, which means that if a stream is on the impaired waters list, that means it is not meeting very baseline functions and values that it should be, and that it's polluted enough, it's impaired enough that it's going to take very intense effort to restore it up to a level of sufficient health. And that's what we call delisting, meaning we're taking it off the impaired waters list and put it on the restored waters list. It's a lot of background, but macroinvertebrates are really key to this whole process. So I wanted to give you this slide for that sense. Macroinvertebrates are important, but we're trying to restore the entire stream ecosystem. So some background. Aquatic macroinvertebrate sampling tells us that many streams are very degraded in Pennsylvania and throughout this country. However, since the passage of the Clean Water Act 50 years ago, there's been improvements to our streams and rivers, but not as much improvement in the last 20 years. The rate of improvement has really kind of leveled off as we've started wrestling with harder, more challenging problems like non-point source runoff to deal with. So our future improvements to our streams are really going to require a lot more projects, better projects, where we're addressing multiple pollutants and multiple stressors. So as we're looking at this issue of delivering agricultural conservation and perhaps working in a targeted watershed, it's important that each of us identify what our own goals are. Stroud, because of our orientation, our approach is we are trying to rebuild the stream ecosystem while reducing pollution to downstream waters like Chesapeake Bay. Both are very important, the overall pollutant loads of our streams, but we can't lose sight that the streams themselves need help, and we need to fix them as we're also trying to reduce pollution to downstream communities. We work with farms because they offer big scale and big impact compared to working with, say, individual homeowners. Headwaters are a great opportunity for us. We, as much as possible, Stroud tries to work as far up in our watersheds as possible, where the streams are the smallest. And the reason for that is that most streams are small streams. First through third order streams account for 86% of all of our flowing streams in Pennsylvania, and in fact, the world. So these small streams give us a lot of real estate to work with, but they also mean that we're working from the top down, from the top of the watershed on down, if possible. And that's good for a lot of reasons. Probably I don't need to explain that much to this group, but keep in mind that for what you're about to see here, the context is small, very small streams that we're talking about, not some of the bigger streams and rivers that you might have in your county. While planting riparian forested buffers is very important to Stroud, and we include it in every one of our farm projects, we really are taking a whole farm approach with each of the landowners that we're working in. So it's not a single practice that we're focused on. It's really a whole farm improvement that we're looking for. And so this just gives you an idea of what we ask farmers that want to work with us and our partners and want to tap Stroud funding. We ask them to do a lot. First, they've got to get those conservation and manure management plans written or updated if they already have them. Where those conservation plans are identifying critical resource concerns, we've got to get best management practices installed to address them. Everything from headquarters improvements around the barnyard to animal trails and walkways, soil conservation, the whole 9 yards. They've got to do a forested buffer on their stream if their stream isn't already forested. And that buffer has got to be 35 feet wide on each side. At a minimum, we try to get wider buffers where we can. And finally, and this is newer for us, but we're also trying to find ways to help farmers improve the health of their soils under their cropland and pasture. And working with a combination of less tillage, more cover crops, greater crop rotation diversity, and other practices, we're trying to improve the health of the soils on the farms that we're working with. So why trees? Why are trees so important? Well, you probably all know a lot of the traditional benefits of buffers that have been discussed at great length. I want to talk to you about one that often flies under the radar screen as a benefit, but it is arguably the most important, or one of the most important. That being that trees on small meadow streams really change the stream channel itself. I could show you many, many pictures, just like what you're seeing here, of the same stream. And this is a stream of one cooperator we're working with, where he's got part of his stream flowing through meadow. And you can see on the left-hand side, very narrow, very fast, unstable, and very little stream bed habitat for water, for natural water treatment capacity. Just 100 yards downstream, you see the same stream, and the only difference being that it's flowing through an older forest, right? And look at the difference in those channels. I wanted to show you this because we don't generally do a lot of stream restoration, active in-channel work as part of our projects, other than some basic bioengineering with live staking. And that's because trees can do so much for free in terms of transforming that stream environment, including establishing a wider channel, a stable channel with good habitat, all for free, but it just takes a while. So where we're working on a stream where simply trees are needed to improve the stream corridor condition, that's what we need to go for, because stream restoration with those highly engineered plans is very, very expensive, and we just can't afford to do it everywhere. So buffers are not a silver bullet. Again, this graph just shows you just some of the many benefits of these buffers, but it's not a silver bullet. But at the same time, we really have to include forested buffers on every one of our farm projects, because we can have a perfectly run farm with very little runoff. But if we don't get trees in the streams, that stream's never going to recover. So Lancaster County, here's the context we're working in. And I wanted to show you this map because not only is Lancaster County the major single leading source of Chesapeake Bay pollution for nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment of any county in Pennsylvania, it also happens to have a lot of impaired streams, which are the green lines on this map. Our approach is to try to do as much as we can to reduce that pollutant load from every farm we work in that might ultimately get to the Chesapeake Bay, but also work on that stream to get it off of the impaired waters list. So 20 years from now, hopefully this map is going to look very different with fewer streams on the impaired waters list. But it's a heavy lift to delist a stream. So here's this map again showing these 18, the red and the blue watersheds here, where the Lancaster Clean Water Partners, of which Stroud is a member, has targeted for intensive work to try to get these streams off of Pennsylvania DEP's impaired waters list. We have many, many hundreds of these types of watersheds around the strait, probably thousands. So this is just one small piece of a stream recovery program for Pennsylvania. But in Lancaster County, we're starting small and identifying these 18 tributaries, these 18 watersheds to work in. And I'm going to be talking about that small watershed in the upper right-hand corner called Hammertown Branch with that red arrow that's there. The Hammertown tributary doesn't have a name. It's an unnamed tributary. It's about 1,000 acres. About a dozen farm landowners. Half of this watershed is forested, which is really important because we've got good bugs and other organisms in the headwaters that can populate those agricultural areas downstream in this watershed as conditions improve. We have a real mix of Amish and Old Order Mennonites in this watershed, and they've been excellent partners. We've had a really great response from the farmers here. We're doing all kinds of best management practices, Stroud and our other partners like NRCS and the district and Chesapeake Bay Foundation. You can see in the upper left-hand corner, we've got that new buffer planted, but we're also working on manure storage and barnyard improvements for that farmer who also happens to be a leading no-till and cover crop Amish farmer in this watershed. And right next to that, you can start to see in that next picture, you can see the tree starting to fill in as it becomes a mature forested buffer. But we're doing a lot of different stuff in this watershed. The buffers, though, are key because this stream is too warm, as many of our ag water streams are, too warm for a lot of our higher quality fish and insects to live. So we've got to get the stream shaded. We've got to get more leaves falling in the stream, which is a major food source for a lot of organisms. And so what is really exciting about this is the agricultural portion of this Hammertown tributary that I just showed you the map for. Every landowner in the agricultural valley here that's on the stream now has a forested buffer. Just this spring, we finally planted the last few gaps in the buffer. So we can do this forested buffer work even with hesitant landowners if we integrate it in with the wider best management practices installations that we need to do on the whole farms. And again, just take a look. This is just two of the buffers on this stream, this Hammertown branch. You can see how tiny this 35-foot buffer is compared to the surrounding farmland. We're talking about a tiny sliver of the landscape, but it's an essential sliver that we've got to get forested. Frankly, our science tells us that 35 feet is really not wide enough for all the functions and values that the stream needs from the buffer, but it's a compromise with agriculture. But I encourage you to look at that 35-foot setback, which is a lot for some landowners to swallow, but it really is about as small as we can get and still get the benefits we need, at least some of them, out of the forested buffer we install. So in addition to doing the agricultural implementation, we are monitoring this stream for macroinvertebrates, nutrients, turbidity, temperature, and that gives us lots of data that we can talk to farmers about. So these are three other streams. This is a graph that I showed these farmers in this watershed to give them a sense of what a forested stream looks like at the top very stable, great macroinvertebrate scores there. Whereas at the bottom, that's an agricultural watershed where we only did stream bank fencing and not buffers. And it's actually degrading through time. What we want to do is get as many of these targeted small watersheds to look like this Valley Creek, where slow but steady improvements, and they've been very slow because all we did in Valley Creek is put in buffers and not the other ag BMPs. Can we get more rapid improvements in small watersheds where we're doing whole farm conservation and buffers in a targeted sort of blanketing way? Here's another graph that I showed these farmers. On the left, we have a reference stream with really good bugs. On the right, an urban stream with very poor bugs. And the yellow and red bars in this graph represent sampling sites on this Hammertown branch. So these are sampling sites on the farms that we're also doing the conservation work on. And you can see the very first farm on the left with the yellow bar is still got really good water coming out of the woods and good macroinvertebrates, great insects. But as soon as the water flows out into that unprotected, unshaded agricultural valley, the macroinvertebrates just drop off the cliff. We've got to, through this time, get all those scores back up into at least that fair category if we're going to delist this stream, to take it off the impaired waters list. So,
10 minutes left.
Yes, thank you. To conclude, I want to just pose a couple of questions. Why would we want to target in this way? Well, for one thing, it's much easier to measure the impact of the best management practices and buffers we're installing on these farms than if we were working in a really big watershed with lots of farms, lots of noise, right? Secondly, this brings the clean water message right home to our backyards versus some downstream water body like the Chesapeake or the Gulf of Mexico that farmers may not care that much about. This brings clean water to their back door. We're talking about cleaning up their own streams and their own water. It builds connections with neighbors that are going to be so important for long-term watershed restoration. I would say one thing that I want to do better and find ways to do is to involve farmers at the front end as decision makers in this process. But that's something that I'm still working on as an advocate. But there's challenges with targeting. I won't tell you that targeting is the way to go, or at least not the only way to go. You have much higher outreach costs as compared to being able to work with farmers anywhere in a county or anywhere in a region where you can just get them together in a room like this, talk about what kinds of conservation assistance you can provide, and then let the farmers come to you in a very organic process. In a targeted process, you're really having to go door to door and trying to get every farmer to participate. And what if you have a farmer that only wants to do a couple of things and doesn't want to come up to the standards of your program? Well, do you take that person in because you really want to get every farmer involved? It's a challenge. Also, what really high priority projects where we could get a lot done and reduce a lot of runoff are we missing because that farmer just happens to be outside of one of our targeted watersheds, right? And alongside that, what message are we sending to the non-targeted farmers who may not be able to tap our resources in that concentrated efforts? So what I'm going to throw out there is perhaps the sweet spot. And yes, these are pawpaws, delicious pawpaws that came from the woods in the headwaters of that Hammertown branch, that Hammertown tributary. Maybe the sweet spot for this effort and for the way we can do conservation better is to implement a small number of targeted watershed projects where we can use those as learning laboratories and monitor our impact, but also make sure we have strong programs that are region-wide or county-wide, so we really can help any farmer that wants to improve their farm. And with that, I'll stop, and hopefully I've left enough time for a few questions.
Yes, as a reminder, everyone, feel free to put questions into the Q&A. We do have one already waiting for us. So Kevin asks, how do you decide what watersheds to target? Are there any equity considerations as you're choosing areas to target?
Okay, so I'll just explain how the the watersheds were chosen in this Lancaster context, because you're right, there could be a lot of different criteria to use. What the Lancaster Clean Water Partners wants to achieve is, in the next 10 to 20 years, have enough small victories, meaning small watersheds, that we've been able to take off the impaired waters list, so that we can really kind of have some success stories to talk to Lancaster County residents and farmers about, because frankly, they're getting tired of bad news that we're not getting stuff done fast enough. So what that has meant is that we've really wanted to emphasize streams that have a relatively good chance of success. And in terms of going from a very poor condition to perhaps a fair or good condition for stream health. That means we really need forested headwaters. It's very hard to get a stream that has no forests in its headwaters off the impaired waters list. We want to know that there's enough landowners in that area that are willing to work with us, so that we're going to have lots of helpful places to work. And perhaps even we want enough older projects already in place, both as examples to neighbors, but also that we're not starting from scratch. We already have some good work on the ground that hopefully has started the water quality improvement process underway versus starting from scratch. That doesn't really get at the equity issue, which is a big one, but that's how we've done it in Lancaster County.
Fantastic. And remember, everyone, if you would like to ask your question via audio, just use the raise hand feature. So we have a couple more for you. What commitment do the farmers make to maintain their buffer areas or do they have to remain out of cultivation or grazing?
Yeah. How they maintain their buffers?
What commitment do they make to maintain the buffer areas, to leave them out of cultivation or out of grazing?
Good question. A lot of our buffers are done under the CREP program, but not all of them. Some farmers are happy just to work with, say, Stroud or some other group that'll just plant the trees. This issue of buffer maintenance is so important, both from a standpoint of making sure that these buffers survive and thrive, and become billboards for success, not failure. But also the fact that maintenance is a big concern of a lot of our farmers. We, as a Lancaster County conservation community, have pretty much committed to taking care of the maintenance, particularly in the first 3 to 4 critical establishment years, with outside funding, so that where a farmer really doesn't have interest or time to do the maintenance, we're going to do that for them. That means herbicide applications or other ways of controlling weeds. It means replanting dead trees. It means mowing wherever we can. We're going to provide all those services to farmers in these targeted watersheds.
Awesome, thank you. And we have a question from Brian. Has the Stroud Center and partners considered providing payments for ecosystem services for farms who are maintaining excellent stewardship, implementing and maintaining the comprehensive whole farm, field, and stream approach?
These are amazing questions. I just had a meeting with a key partner group this week about that very thing. We'd really like to move in that direction, or at least have a few cases or watersheds where we can try out this payment for ecosystem services model. I think generally Pennsylvania farms, because of farm size, are not going to compete well in the carbon market, right? The Midwest farms with those big fields are probably going to have an easier time making the numbers work in the carbon market. So can we figure out ways to stack benefits, either through trading, credits, or just special programs where we're paying for those ecosystem services as a means of incentivizing continued good maintenance of BMPs and hopefully improved management through time? That's something that's missing right now in this effort. And we don't have funding at the ready to offer those types of payments to farmers. It's not a place where a lot of our funders have wanted to go, or at least we haven't been successful in getting that kind of funding in line yet. but it is something that I personally would really, really like to test. I think we need to find ways to incentivize excellence, and our stream monitoring programs can be a great way to document success, to basically provide that incentive alongside our cost share programs, which are basically meant to fix problems. How can we reward excellence? So great question.
Awesome. We are technically at time, but there's one more question that I think would be great if people don't mind staying on just a second longer. Can you talk about what challenges these projects face in reestablishing of the bug populations? Does the targeting take into account that there are healthy populations upstream or downstream that maybe can repopulate the area?
Yes, I think without question, if we've got good bugs in the headwaters, that repopulation of good bugs downstream is going to happen faster. However, and this is a kind of on the frontier of some science, at least as I understand it, but our entomology staff feel pretty confident that because so many of these macroinvertebrates are winged as adults and can fly around, they are very good at finding new streams nearby that they can lay eggs and repopulate streams that may not have good bugs currently. So it's not like we've got to have those high populations of macroinvertebrates in the headwaters. It's just, I think, a matter of time. If the water quality improves in a given stream, the bugs will find that stream sooner or later. It just may take a while.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lamont. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Just a quick reminder of what's coming up next week. I've got the slide up here. We'll be hearing about wildlife in the watershed, and we've got some hellbenders on the screen, so you never know what kind of fun and excitement we'll have. But Lamont, thank you again. It was a fantastic presentation. And folks, if you have any questions at all, please connect with us and we will make sure Lamont gets them if you come up with a question after today's program. So thank you again, everyone, and another successful Watershed Wednesday. We'll see you all next week.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.